Can you revive someone with external cardiac massage? Can someone be knocked out by a simple tap on their head? And what are the dangers of both eye poking and eye gouging? Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. In anticipation of the crossover event between Baki and the Kengan Ashura anime, we're going to be taking a look at some more Baki fights, and today to kick it off we've got Yujiro versus Doppo Orochi. Let me know if there's any other fights you'd like me to break down, and if you're ready, let's begin. So, to start off with, we can see that Yujiro's putting his son to sleep. What a good dad. But is something like this possible? Well, it's interesting because it looks like he's tapped him just in front of the ear and around his cheekbone, and this is where several different skull bones converge in a weak point called the pterion. And if it's hit hard enough, this could damage the underlying middle meningeal artery that runs to the brain. Remember that any disruption in blood supply to the brain can lead to a loss of consciousness. However guys, if you're needing to put your child to sleep, I'd advise against this and maybe try some more traditional methods. So that's a very creative way to take off someone's glasses, but it also looks like it has drawn some blood. But the danger with taking a kick to this part of the forehead is that is the location of the supratrochlear veins. Those are the prominent veins you see bulging in someone's forehead. And if damaged, this could lead to a fairly significant hematoma that might go on to distort someone's facial appearance. So Doppo, you might want to get some ice onto that. Gosh, that's a pretty powerful punch that Doppo's thrown there, targeting Yujiro's heart. But it kind of reminds me of one of the moves that we've seen in some of the Kengan Ashura fights. Nonetheless, it looks like there's significant force there to penetrate through all of Yujiro's ribs and directly traumatize his heart, effectively delivering a death blow. And it's interesting that Doppo's targeted this area specifically because it's probably one of the most vulnerable points on the chest where the heart is actually exposed. I love how their measure of macho-ness or strength comes down to the animals that they've beaten up. I think so far we've seen Yujiro defeat a giant ape, a polar bear, and a giant elephant. And I might be misremembering this, but has he also defeated a crocodile? And I like how this character is just comparing all of those to a tiger. This should definitely be in one of those videos titled Baki out of context. Nonetheless, a direct kick to the balls can often disable any opponent, and that's because you've got such a high density of nerve fibers, making the area highly sensitive to pain. I seem to remember in the later seasons that someone gets flicked in the balls, and this is enough to cause them to black out. So here Doppo goes on to explain how karate masters are able to defend against surprise groin attacks. One way of doing this is to actually clench your butt cheeks whilst externally rotating your hips. What this does, it flexes your inner thigh muscles, closing your thigh gap, meaning that if someone does kick you, the first thing they'll hit is the muscles rather than your balls. The other method, of course, is to wear a groin cup all the time, but I can't see that being Doppo's style.
よし、もっと待ってこい。
オロチドッポだ
な。If there's one thing I've learned about the Baki world, is that if you're a martial arts artist, you can never take a moment to relax. You just never know where the next strike is going to come from. But it looks like the first chop here that he takes from Yujiro slashes his temporal artery, which is an artery found at the side of the head and supplies the scalp and the face. And the next kick looks like it slashes just over the zygomatic bone, the bone that makes up your cheekbone. And considering that it's a kick coming from Yujiro Hanma, you'd have to worry about him having fractured that bone, and therefore he'd need an X-ray and possibly even surgery to fix this.
私の反応をコンマ1秒遅らせた。
そりゃ艦長、あなたが悪い。武道家は日常が試合なんだから、負けた言い訳なんてありえない。
You've got to love how Baki's schooling Doppo here about getting a beating from his dad. Nonetheless, I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept that alcohol can slow down your reaction times, and that's the whole reason why you shouldn't drink and drive. And there are several different ways that alcohol does this, but the main one to be aware of is that alcohol actually increases the activity of a neurotransmitter called GABA on the brain. And it's this neurotransmitter that has an inhibitory activity on your brain. So when its levels go up, your neuronal activity and neuronal firing goes down, leading to slower reaction times.
奇襲！伝説の武神、なんと不意打ちを仕掛けました。100キロを超える私の落下を受け止めた足腰のバネ、とりあえず褒めてやる。
And so the fight begins between these two beasts, and the last thing you'd expect from a karate master is him jumping up into the air and onto your back. But the effectiveness of this move is that by applying all of his weight onto Yojiro's upper torso, it causes him to hunch forward. And at the same time, Doppo's applying a neck choke, straightening him up. So you've basically got this counterbalance between falling forward and being pulled upright that causes Yujiro to effectively choke himself out. That's one way of getting someone off of your back. And I've only just noticed, but wasn't it Baki or Pickle who did the same move in the latest season of the show? Of course, depending on the height that you fall from will determine the types of injuries you're likely to sustain, and also whether or not you're going to be knocked out. Just remember that old statistic. If you fall from 5 stories high, you've got a 50% chance of surviving, whereas if you fall from a 10-story building, it's about 90% chance fatality. So it looks like Yujiro here has used Doppo's gi against him, a common move performed in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And then going on to plant his elbow into his throat could certainly be fatal. The types of injuries you might expect is a fracture to the larynx affecting Doppo's ability to speak, possibly a hematoma of his windpipe affecting his ability to both breathe and swallow, not to mention the potential damage that this move has done to his C-spine. I think if I was his doctor, I'd advise Doppo to wear a neck brace as a minimum following on from this fight.
2人の低空圏が触れた。さすがだオロチ。
I don't know how this went from Baki 1 minute to almost Dragon Ball Z the next. I'm guessing that these spheres has something to do with both Yujiro and Doppo's fighting spirit, or their fighting aura. But what it reminds me of, in reality, is where fighters talk about finding the distance between themselves and their opponents. And fighters normally do this by throwing a few punches to determine the distance their opponent is from them, with the ones who figure it out quicker being able to land more accurate punches and have a better chance of winning the fight. And it looks like Doppo has figured it out first.
五段突き。あれじゃあ肋骨はめちゃめちゃだろう。
地 常最強の生物ついにダウンか
Wow, I think this is the first time I've seen Yujiro downed by an opponent, and I don't think we see it ever again in this series so far, right? But 5 punches to the chest with sufficient force to cause indents in his anatomy, I think they're thinking correctly in that this has damaged his ribs. What can happen if you break enough ribs is that a part of the chest can detach from the rest of it, almost becoming a floating island of ribs that we refer to as a flail segment. Now the danger with this is that this floating segment of ribs doesn't move when you breathe, and so can actually compress your lungs, making it difficult to breathe, which might account for why Yujiro has dropped to his knees.
なんとオロチ選手連撃技を全てかわした
I love the sound effects of his eyes dotting and darting around. But unfortunately, I can't say that I've ever heard of a case of someone having this level of control of both of their eyes separately. I mean, I've certainly seen cases where people have a lazy eye, and this is typically where one of the muscles that help to move the eye is weaker on one side. But to be able to voluntarily move one of your eyes left whilst also controlling your other eye to go right seems impossible to me.
なぜ避けられん
50年間一日も休まず磨き続けた打撃の境地ケタブロの反射神経も追いつかぬよそれ
So Yujiro isn't able to keep up with Doppo's super fast reflexes or even evade his punches. And Doppo's explanation for this is that through painstaking training over several decades, throwing hundreds of punches a day, he's been able to sharpen his reflexes. But is such a thing possible? Yes, so reflexes are basically a combination of neural processing, muscle response, and cognitive anticipation, all of which can be enhanced by using specific exercise regimens. This might include things like using a reaction ball to react to its erratic movements, or flashlight drills to quicken your response times. And of course, everything is limited by the body that you have, so strength training is also very essential.
オロチトッポよくぞここまで来たよよくぞここまで作り上げたこれが貴様に送る最大の賛辞だ
So I remember there was a time where I wasn't a believer in the demon back anatomy. In fact, I made a whole video about it, and I'll leave a link down below in the description. But since making that video, I have to admit I've seen several different examples of people with physiques like this, so in that case I was wrong. And to be honest, I'm still quite flabbergasted that someone can get abs on their back. I mean, I still don't even know what muscle causes that. If you know, let me know down below. So it looks like that kick from Yujiro has torn through Doppo's bicep tendon. Now remember that your bicep is what allows you to flex at the elbow and therefore bring your arms up to defend yourself, so this is quite a tactful attack from Yujiro. Now, if that biceps tendon is completely severed, then Doppo's going to need to have urgent surgery to reimplant it back into its normal site. And the longer you leave it, the less likely you are to regain its normal function. And so Doppo needs to get to a surgeon pretty sharpish.
いかに空手の歴史が深かろうが所詮は人間を対象に作られた技術だ本気になった裕次郎はもう人の域ではない
So we can see here that Doppo is semi-conscious here after taking a pummeling from Yujiro. I'm beginning to understand how all those animals felt fighting him, but this is probably one of the best explanations as to why Yujiro is undefeatable. Martial arts was created to fight human beings, and they don't work against Yujiro because he's a beast. gosh, okay, so 2 direct blows to Doppo's ear, and it looks like he's ruptured both of his eardrums. Now, this could render Doppo not only deaf, but also affect his balance, making it far more difficult for him to throw accurate punches. And some of you are probably wondering whether this is going to be a permanent injury for Doppo. However, it takes about 6 weeks for your eardrums to totally repair themselves. If they haven't in that time frame, you might need surgery to replace them. But also, this move kind of reminds me of what Jack Hanma attempted to do to Pickle with using his middle fingers to try to perforate someone's eardrums. It's nice to see in later seasons that there are some callbacks to classical fights like this. So it looks like Doppo's done a better job than I have in identifying all of his injuries. But with the extent of the amount of fractures that he's reporting on, it would probably be sensible for him to get something called a skeletal survey, which is basically an X-ray of the whole body, which helps to define all of the broken bones. But also, it's interesting because he mentions that he has some cerebral hemorrhaging that I don't think we saw earlier. Now, this is probably the most life-threatening out of all the injuries that he sustained, because depending on how big the bleeding is, it can compress the brain and cause brain swelling that could ultimately lead to unconsciousness and even coma.
まだやらせてくれるというのか。感謝。
Oh gosh, what a horrible injury, with Yujiro poking out Doppo's eye. You know, I'd always wondered where he got this injury. But it looked like Yujiro initially just poked the eye, and then he forced his palm into his thumb, almost like a hammer on a nail, to make the injury far worse. Now, this could have caused an orbital dislocation, where the eye effectively pops out of its socket, or he could have ruptured the eyeball completely, a bit like how you'd pop a balloon. Either way, both injuries could be sight-threatening, and so I completely understand now why Doppo wears an eye patch for the rest of the seasons.
よもやこいつを使えるとはな。死んだぞ。
God, 3 powerful punches to Doppo's chest, causing his heart to stop completely. Now, this could be due to the direct trauma to the rib cage that is breaking those ribs and causing them to penetrate into Doppo's heart. Or alternatively, the powerful punches might be disrupting the electrical activity in the heart, causing an arrhythmia that can lead to a cardiac arrest. Interestingly, this is also a method for restarting the heart, and we call it a precordial thump. It's almost like a shock into getting the heart to beat again.
先生、用意できました。
生食は 1200cc。瞳孔、脈拍、全部あかん。蘇生女子、時間との勝負や。
Okay, so here they're looking for any signs of life within Doppo. Clearly he has no pulse, and then they're checking his pupils to see if they're reactive to light. And this is relevant because soon after death, the pupils dilate and they remain fixed in this way. However, my only criticism of these doctors is that once you've established that somebody's heart has stopped, you should immediately start CPR rather than checking someone's pupils. What you really want to do is try to maintain their circulation to get blood flow to their brain.
反応ありません。
動かんか。動け。
反応ありません。
So after attempting the defibrillator, Doppo's heart still hasn't restarted. So the doctor abandons this and he starts performing these precordial thumps that I spoke about earlier. The way that this works is like an electrical reset, much like the idea of using a defibrillator, however it's far less powerful and less controlled. What these thumps can do is that they can momentarily disrupt the chaotic electrical activity in the heart, allowing the heart's natural pacemaker cells to establish a more normal rhythm.
その断りさえ知るなら、鍛え抜いたはずの体を一瞬で破壊すること。また、破壊された体を再生させることもさほど難しいことではない。麻酔完了。
The science of Dr. Kureha even leaves me fascinated. I mean, I'm aware that acupuncture can offer some anesthetic properties, but why would this need to be administered to a dead man? That is Doppo Orochi. I think I need to make a whole video just breaking down the medical science of Dr. Kureha to see what's fact versus fiction. If you'd like to see that video, let me know down below.
なんやと直接心臓マッサージしよるか
そうです。人体を完全に熟知するのは、皮膚を傷つけず心臓をコントロールすることなど造作もないこと。
So I'm quite familiar with the concept of cardiac massage. It's effectively doing the same thing as chest compressions would do during CPR. However, I've only ever heard it being used when the heart was exposed, say for example during cardiothoracic surgery. And to be very honest, I think it's pretty much impossible to be doing what Dr. Kureha is doing in this scene. I mean, think about it. Just to get to the heart, you'd have to separate the abdominal wall muscles, then penetrate your hand through the diaphragm before you could then get to the heart to massage it. So I'm sorry, Dr. Kureha, but this isn't medicine, this is malpractice.
反応出ました。
取り急ぎ自律呼吸まで復活させておきました。
So as bizarre as it is to witness, Doppo has actually regained consciousness, but I can't say that I'm going to be trialling this in my own practice. It is important to mention though, he's not out of the woods yet, because you're at most risk of having a further cardiac arrest straight after the first one. So I would suggest he goes to an intensive care unit where he has some monitoring before they give him the all clear.
色が良くないようだがチャンピオン。生死の現場は初めてなのかな。知人の死を目の当たりにしたショックのために循環器系が軽いパニック状態にあるようだ。大丈夫かね。そんな体調で。
Here, it looks like Baki's gone into some form of psychological shock, otherwise known as tonic immobility or a freeze response. And this typically occurs when you get activation of a sympathetic nervous system, which activates your fight or flight response. Now, if your body does this to an inescapable threat, this can actually activate these freeze responses. And this is where your parasympathetic nervous system is triggered, leading to a state of tonic immobility. And this is characterized by a temporary paralysis, a decrease in responsiveness, and an inability to both speak and move, like Baki's demonstrating in this scene. Okay guys, that's all we have time for today. I'll leave 2 more videos up here if you're keen to watch more Baki. Otherwise, let's continue to build the hype for the upcoming crossover of the Baki and Kengan Ashura anime. Otherwise guys, thanks for watching and I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks.